When you use the word natal, you talk about natal care, which means care having to do with birth, but also there is a certain kind of chart in astrology called the natal chart that deals with where the planets were when you were born, as opposed to the transit chart, which deals with moving planets throughout your life. Okay, so however you want to look at it, natal is the adjective having to do with birth, having been born. So, and natal care is another good example of that. And there's nature. Okay, so nature from natura in Latin. The ur is one of those linguistic endings that just means about to be. It literally means about to be born. Nature is about to be born. Has to do with the fact that there's a future for things that are born as opposed to only the things that already have been born. But that's a noun, natura, from which we get nature. Quite often the A at the end of a Latin noun is turned into an E when it's brought over into English through Old French. So if you learn French, you notice a lot of words end in silent E's, and that's where we get the silent E, by the way. All right. And the idea behind Native Americans, for example, and there's other obviously ways of using the term native, but the idea behind that is, hey, we Native Americans were here first. That's true, but the idea is that we were born here. We're actually indigenous to this territory, whereas you came by ship. That's the idea behind the name Native America, or native anything. It means born somewhere, coming from a place, as opposed to moving to it from somewhere else. Okay? That's the idea behind that. And this little kid reading is the best I could do for a photograph, somewhat trying to illustrate the idea behind the word innate. Nate, obviously same root as all the ones above. In means in or inside. So it means inborn. Okay, inborn itself, the English word inborn, comes from the German side, because born or birth, all those words are from Anglo-Saxon. So when something is innate, it means you were born with it. Okay, whereas natal is the adjective meaning having to do with being born. Native means someone or something that was born somewhere. Innate means a quality or characteristic that is born with you, or born with a certain person, that was in them when they were born. And so this kid reading, what I'm thinking of is, at least in linguistics, there's this theory by Noam Chomsky that we are born with the capability to learn language, when from the very outset in the structure of our minds, which is why, relatively speaking, it's so much easier for children to pick up language than adults. That's Chomsky's way of explaining why that's the case. This idea that we're inborn, we have an innate ability to learn languages, as opposed to what John Locke in the 17th century would have called the tabula rasa theory, the clean slate theory, that we're just born with nothing in our brains and everything is from the ground up added on to the nothing. Okay, so there's a big difference there in belief. Okay, so innate means you're born with something, innate abilities. And nascent, okay, interesting word. When something is nascent, it means being born. It means coming into fruition. In the case of a sprout such as this, if you describe it as nascent, it means in its very earliest stages. Okay, when something's so you can metaphorize that, and you could talk about knowledge being nascent knowledge. So if you're just getting to learn something new, you don't have as much knowledge about it as you're going to. So you have a nascent understanding of the subject matter. Okay, it's a good word. All right. So we talk about the Renaissance. Where does that idea come from? Okay, the people of the Renaissance, 15th century, especially starting in Italy, then going on to France, going on to Holland. The idea was a rebirth. Okay, literally in French means rebirth. Ens, it should be familiar to us. We have the ENS, the E, the ANS, all those kinds of endings. It's the exact same thing, comes from Latin, meaning being. Okay, being. So the state of. So the state of what? The state of being reborn. The nasc, N-A-I-S-S, same exact root as the N-A-S-C. It's just you lose the C, because in Latin, the C is always hard. It's always a K, like a K sound. And so you lose that in order to soften it, to make it, to facilitate its being brought into French. And that's where the nasc comes from, as opposed to nasc or nasc. And then the re, as we all know, means again, or back. Okay, so what did the people of the Renaissance think of themselves as reviving? The idea was it was a rebirth of ancient Greece and Rome. It was a rebirth of, especially reacting to the 1,000 years that had preceded them, of the Christian church pretty much in a lot of ways being in charge of things, a rebirth of what was considered to be a kind of secular approach to life from ancient Greece and Rome, which, by the way, is not very accurate because there was plenty of religious stuff in Greece and Rome. There was this idea that the Renaissance was a rebirth of something that preceded the Middle Ages, and that's why it's called the Middle Ages, quite pejoratively, actually. You know, this idea, this is the middle stuff, the stuff that came after the best stuff and before the rebirth of the best stuff. You see what I'm saying? So it's really a kind of loaded idea there. We think of the United States of America as being a nation, as we are all one nation. And what does that mean? It means, as it says here, a large aggregate of people united by a common descent, history, culture, or language. And the real focus here when it comes to etymology is on descent, the idea that theoretically we are all born here. Okay, that's the idea. And that's why there's so much of an ado made from the very beginning by the founding fathers of this idea of naturalization, of being part of the United States. You need to have either been born here or to demonstrate a knowledge enough to convince others that you have been. And that is an interesting word in itself, this idea of to naturalize, because you would expect it to be nationize, really, right? Because that's the idea, to become part of a nation filled with others who were either born here or demonstrate enough of a knowledge and interest in becoming part of it to where they just about become natives. Okay, so it's all connected to the idea of being born in a place. And to naturalize is to make. We know the eyes, right, coming from Greek. The eyes, from ezein, that verb that we learned about, that means to do or make. And then to naturalize is to become, in effect, part of the nation which is filled with a bunch of people who were supposedly born here. Okay, so that's the idea, at least. Okay. And then we'll end on this route with an interesting word that relatively few people know where it comes from. It is connected to this idea of birth, of kind of infancy. And why is that? If someone is naive, it says here, of a person or action showing a lack of experience, wisdom, or judgment, the idea is that you are as if you had just been born, okay, in a pejorative sense, in a kind of putting down someone. So here, among many examples of the idea of naivete, okay, which would be the noun for naive, the adjective. Naive realism, the idea that, you know, if all you do is judge by your senses and what they perceive on a molecular level, you will assume that the world consists of nothing but these objects that we're looking at in front of us. But if you get a microscope, or if you know anything about modern physics, you know that the deeper you go down into things, into the atomic and subatomic level and beyond, the more that all of that is an illusion. Okay, so that's one example of naivete in a kind of institutional context, this idea of judging things by their cover, as we might say, okay, by how they seem to you, as opposed to what they are deep down. Spec and spect, as usual, since this root comes from a verb, a Latin verb, you're going to have those two forms, the active and the passive. And don't forget, once you bring the passive into English, then it loses its passivity and it becomes active quite often. And that is the case with, say, a spectator, right? So what do I mean by that? Just to remind you, so spect means, or the spectus means having been seen. Okay, spectus, having been seen. Bring that root into English and you talk about a spectator. It doesn't mean someone being seen. It means someone looking at something, okay? So that's a good example of bringing a passive form from Latin into English, and it assumes an active meaning. Now that's not because it's active, it's just because most of the words that have a fundamental meaning are active. Because that's our bias in our language. We look at the world from our perspective and how we act on it. There are languages that have a default of looking at the world where the focus is on things outside of the individual and how they impinge upon the individual. Instead of the focus being on me doing something in relation to something, it would be the something and then me being affected by that something. So it would be the complete reverse. And in that case, words that came from a more primal root source would take actives and turn them into passives. All right. Spectacles. What are spectacles? They're things that you use to look at things with, to be able to see them more clearly. Spectator, even though it comes from spectus, which means having been seen in Latin, a spectator is one who looks at something. So, or people who look at something are the spectators, and that's who they are there. Spectators wearing spectacles. So when you inspect something, it's kind of interesting that the noun of the verb inspect is inspection, for reasons we'll get to in a second. It didn't have to be that way. To inspect something means to look into it. And that's what this sleuth is doing from the German side, sleuth, looking into something. Now we're going to come back to this sleuth. We're going to come back to this GIF of the sleuth in a little while in connection with the next root, just to get across that there is a common thread between the two words used to describe him. Okay, so inspection is the state of, or being, looking into. When you expect something, you're looking outside for something to happen, if you think about it. Inspect, you have a certain area that you want to know about what's going on in it, and you look in there at it. To expect is to look outside of yourself at something in the future that you either hope will happen or think will happen without necessarily hoping it'll happen. All right, so you're looking out. Now notice that we would expect it to be EXSPECT if we're going to go by the model of inspect. Why wouldn't it be expect? Purely phonetic. You're dropping the S because the X covers the S. Why? Because an X is really KS. Okay? An X is really a transliteration from ancient Greek of a KS sound, if you think about it. Okay, so to expect something is to expect it, and you're dropping that S. Okay, now I found this one. This is kind of, whatever. When I looked at the word respect, interestingly, I guess, whatever, I told you guys I like to go to Google Image to get a sense of what's in the mainstream when it comes to words and what they represent, and it was almost all a racial, it was almost all a black and a white getting along vibe, okay, if you look at all the pictures. And at first I avoided putting it up because I was like, okay, I don't want to be all corny and whatever, and but there it is. I mean, it's a really good, regardless of what races we might be talking about and the fact of race, this and that, the point is that you have two people looking at each other in a way that seems to be genuine respect, okay, regardless of race, regardless of belief, regardless of whatever. And that's the whole idea behind respecting someone, is that you are on a level with them and you're looking at them and treating them with respect. What does that mean? So that's tautological. It means looking back at them. Looking back at them. They're looking back at you, you're looking back at them, and you're meeting each other in the middle. Your gaze kind of meets between the two of you, and there's a sense of equality there. There's a sense of mutual respect. Okay, and that's the idea. So I consider this to be the best photo illustrating that, because they're both looking at each other. And then you get the different words from it. Respectful is full of respect, obviously. And then respectable, just as obviously able to be respected. So able in the sense of deserving of respect. All right? And then here's Freud, a quote from Freud. I couldn't really get a good image that illustrated The idea of retrospect, retrospection, retrospective, looking back, because you're dealing with a pure action. But he says, one day, in retrospect, the years of struggle will strike you as the most beautiful. Okay, there are a lot of quotes from the ancient world as well. A real famous one, if anybody knows the Aeneid, when they're in a storm and they're almost all dying, and they say, one day we'll look back at this and pretty much laugh at it. We'll have great memories of this as long as we survive this. That's the idea. Looking back in time. Retro means back, as you guys know. Retro, back, and then spec means to look. So looking back one day, the years of struggle will strike you as the most beautiful. Right? The things that shape you, shape your character, as long as you survive them. All right. Now, this is the best I could do with an image illustrating circumspection. Circumspection, as you know, the curriculum means around. So it means to look around, to be careful. To be circumspect means to be careful. It means to look around before you leap. Look before you leap. Look around before you commit to something. And in this case, it says both ways, which is not exactly the same as circumspect, because circumspect is not necessarily just two things. It could be around. So you're talking about in a general sense, going, looking around. But that's a decent way of illustrating it. So look around you to make sure that the coast is clear before you jump. Look before you leap is the idea. All right, so this dude's looking out of binoculars into the distance, and into the distance is the same as saying kind of into the future, what might come toward him or what he might go toward. So you could talk about the prospect of something in a literal way, in the sense of looking forward, literally with your eyes, or with your inner eye, in the sense of the mind, thinking about the future. Or, as you know, you could take it a little more abstractly and refer to the possibility of something happening. What are your prospects? If there's a scout in baseball, what are the prospects of this guy? Is he a good baseball player? And or something like that. So you're talking about looking forward and what may or may not occur in the future. Introspective. Introspect you don't find, and that's why I don't have that isolated. So I used that adjective, introspective. Here we have Rodin's famous, one of his many iterations of the thinker, his famous sculpture. And the idea here is that he's looking and not looking. He's looking down, or maybe not. I don't even know what his eyes are up to. I don't know if they're closed or what. The idea is he's looking inside. So when you're introspective, it's pretty much the opposite of expect. Expect is to look outside for something to occur. Introspection is looking inside at your thoughts, at your feelings, at how, what you think about something, how you feel about something. So there's a retrospective. If you look back at, say, rock and roll from the 70s, and you talk about retro music or retro this or that, and then intro is inside, introspective. Introspection would be the noun. Perspective is looking through, the way you look through things. So there's a situation in front of you, and the idea is, does that situation define itself? No, it depends on you, the perceiver, to make sense of it. And it's your filter, the filter through, perspective, the filter through which you look at things, that determines what you see. So in the case of this landlocked guy on this tiny little island seeing a boat, he's all, cool, the dude with the boat, and the guy in the boat sees the landlocked guy, not thinking that, oh man, he's trapped too, and he's all excited because he sees land. Okay, so it's all a matter of what perspective each of them has. Okay, so you have the quiro in Latin, meaning I seek or seek out or try to find out, inquire into. And then quest is the perfect passive participle, is the passive form of it, and that's where you get the word quest, the idea of going out on a seeking. Now keep in mind, quest means having been sought, okay, when something is in originally Latin, having been sought, but then you bring quest into English, and it means going out to actively seek things. So there's another example of the passive form in Latin becoming active once it's imported into English. Okay, so there's that sleuth again. Inquiring, making an inquiry, the why meaning state of or being, and inquiring. And don't forget, we saw him a second ago in connection with inspect. So that's a shot back to the past. We were on inspect. So there he was inspecting, here he's inquiring. What's the difference? In the one case, you're focusing on the physical act of looking at something with your eyes. And in the next case, you're dealing with the act of the mind of seeking an answer to something. So you're using the mind. See, so in both cases, he's looking into something. In one case, it's physical and literal. In the other case, it's more figurative and mental. Okay, so here we are again. So the word quest itself, when we talk about, for example, a hero quest, means that the hero is seeking out something, seeking to accomplish a goal. That's Perseus up there on the top left, the first of the great Greek heroes. Not the most important, that would be Heracles, but the very first of the major Greek heroes was Perseus, who went out for not that important of a reason, kind of trivial actually, to go out and kill Medusa, the Gorgon. And he does so, and that's his quest. That's his goal. That's the thing he goes out seeking out to accomplish. Okay, and that's where that word comes from. And then, interestingly, from the word quest comes the word question. The ION, as we know, means state of or being. Being a quest, being a looking into. And in a second, we're going to compare this word question with another word that is connected to it. It has a similar root, same root actually, the quir root, and that is query. What's the difference? So there you have question, and I'll read it to you if you can't read it. A sentence worded or expressed so as to elicit information. So when you have a question, the focus is that it's a sentence. A question is a sentence. Think about it. How can you ask a question without it being a sentence? You can't. Unless the stuff is left out of the sentence. Elliptical. So, is it? That's a complete sentence. Is? That's not a complete sentence. So a question is always a complete sentence. And you're seeking information, whereas a query is what? A question. Okay, so the very definition of query includes the word question itself, but what kind of question is it? Especially one addressed to an official organization. So the idea behind query is there's no other way to put it, a fancier type of question. Okay? A question is simply, anybody can ask a question, even a parrot could ask a question if they're trained to. Okay? But a query, just like we talked about the difference between inspect and inquire, so we are now making a distinction between physical and mental again. Okay? Question, anybody can ask a question even if they don't give a damn about what they're asking about. Query implies that the mind is involved, that there's a curiosity of going in to what is being asked. Okay? Now, remember that contrast, because throughout the semester there are going to be various examples of words that focus on the physical or on the mental. And they're really close to each other than that. All right, continuing on with this root, meaning seek, to acquire something, for there to be an acquisition. Acquire is really adquire, but there's a difference in difficulty between saying adquire and acquire, right? So it's easier to say acquire, and there you go. And that's yet another example of the ad turning into what it is. Now, you'll notice here, and I didn't make this distinction before, but it's not acquire, A-Q-Q, okay, but for good reason, because a Q, qua, what you have there is the beginning of the Q sound is a K, and that's, again, from Greek. Okay, so in effect, you do have the K sound repeated by using the C, because in English we have a soft or a hard C, and the hard C is a K sound. You see what I'm saying? So the C is a hard C, and the Q, the sound of the Q begins with the K sound, and that's the connection there. It's a phonetic connection rather than a purely literal one. Okay, so acquire. All right, so to acquire something is to seek toward it. Seek toward it on a very literal level. So what does that mean? So here, this dude has the 3 out of 4 puzzle pieces, but he wants to acquire the 4th. He seeks toward that fourth piece, and he wants to bring it in, and so that you have a complete circle. That's the idea. To acquire something, to acquire a possession or whatever. To conquer is what? To seek with. To seek to bring something together with what is already accomplished or possessed. Okay, and that's the idea behind the Roman Empire. And the idea, first of all, you have Julius Caesar, even before the Roman Empire, in his famous Veni, Vidi, Vici, or Vici quote, "I came, I saw, I conquered," and that's in reference to a relatively minor historical event in which he conquered a relatively small territory. But later on, as time goes on, and more territory in the Roman Empire becomes acquired or conquered. The idea here is that you're seeking out territory to add to the possessions you already have. And that's the idea of to seek with, to seek to bring in with what already is there. And what is already there at the very beginning? Nothing but Rome. Starts with Rome, this tiny little place called Rome, and then slowly but surely, more and more conquering, seeking with Rome, leads to just about the entire known world at the time being conquered by or added to the possessions of what was called the Roman Empire. Now we're going to kind of make a distinction between require and one other word. So when you require something, it's kind of interesting, you seek back. So what does it mean? You look back at this list of requirements for what? For something else to be the case. So before, we'll call this A, B, C, D, and E. A, B, C, D, and E have to be checked off, have to be accomplished before F can happen. All right. So you have all these requirements that need to be achieved before something else can happen. A seeking back, a looking back and making sure that all this stuff is already done, then you move forward, is the idea. Now compare that to this word, prerequisite. And you guys, I bet you know this word really well, because there's all kinds of prerequisites for different classes you have to take. So why is it called that? The pre is really superfluous. It's really unnecessary. A prerequisite is pretty much a requirement. Okay, it's just a way of focusing on or emphasizing the fact that it's something that you need to do before you move on to the next class. Okay, so a requirement, a prerequisite, they're pretty much the same thing. It's just emphatic to put that pre before the re, because you already covered the fact that you have to look back and check things off before you move on. It's just, in a way, it's a patronizing thing. It's, hey students, just so you don't think that a requirement doesn't mean that you don't need to really do it in order to move on, we're going to really emphasize this and put a pre there before the re. Pre-require, as opposed to just require. Got me? All right, that's the idea. Alrighty, any questions with this route, you guys? Okay, so there we go, and there's the ones that we just